WordPress has been having a rough year. Many devs are now asking, is Drupal a better alternative? And today it's time to find out.
Many years ago, they had almost a similar market share. The question is, what happened?
You were going to just build a whole new website in whatever the new version of Drupal was, and then you were going to migrate all of your content to the new website. And Dries was comfortable betting on that mode of doing things. It's greatly slowed down the expansion of the community around that era.
What is the difference between Drupal CMS and Drupal Core?
I was recently chatting with an agency and they said something like, yeah, these recipes are taking what otherwise would be 4 or 10 or 50 hours of clicking, and they're compressing it into just a minute of apply a recipe. You can take an existing site and apply a recipe on top of it. Like for my own website, stevevector.com, I want a better way to do YouTube embeds. But with Drupal CMS, there is now a recipe for remote videos.
So tell me, what would be the most ideal Drupal CMS use case?
What if you could just type, same way you do with ChatGPT, can you make me an events calendar? Can agencies really use these conventions that have been built up around the focusing point of Drupal CMS? Can they use those tools to do the jobs they've been doing all along faster, more effectively? And it looks like yes.
Imagine there is a developer in front of you who is a bit tired of the current situation in WordPress, and he's looking for a new CMS. How would you try to sell Drupal to such a developer?
People all over the tech community compare our tech work to building with Legos. I find that Drupal fulfills that feeling in a way that I don't get with other systems. The way the modules click together, the way the fields click together, I find it viscerally enjoyable. And if someone is approaching this question on a personal level, it's the feelings that will move a person or not. Like I can describe the ways in which I find Drupal can be made more performant more easily. That is nice. But I think what has the potential to move any single person from one system to another is, are you going to get enjoyment from it?
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, where we are going to talk a bit about Drupal. Why Drupal, you might ask? Because we all know that WordPress has the most of the market. But the truth is that there are other CMSs, and there are also a lot of cool CMSs, and Drupal is one of them. Because let's be honest, Drupal is also open source. If I remember correctly, it's already 24 years old. It has a huge community. In short, it's a really great CMS. But sadly, well, it doesn't get all the attention it should get. But lately, Drupal released something cool, so it's a great opportunity to talk about it a bit more. And that's why with me I have Steve Persch, who works at Pantheon, and he knows really quite a lot about Drupal. Right, Steve?
Yes. I've been in the Drupal world for a long time. I made my first Drupal websites in 2007, 1 year after I started making WordPress websites. So it's been a long time for both.
Amazing. And kind of my first question will start with going back the memory lane. Do you remember the times when WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla had almost the same market share? It was
I
the point
do.
it used to. And I think that Joomla was winning a bit, right? And then it was Drupal and WordPress fighting for the second place.
Yes, and I think to some degree it depends on where in the world you are. Like there's differences in the regional adoption, but I distinctly remember sitting in my apartment at, I guess I would have been 22, maybe 23 years old, having all three running on my was it called a PowerBook, whatever the Mac laptop was in 2007. I had all three running in my local MAMP installation because I'd gotten a few sites launched with WordPress. I felt like I knew what I could do with WordPress, but I had heard people were telling me at meetups and whatnot that for certain types of sites I'd be better off with Drupal or Joomla, and I wanted to see. So I was playing with all three, and I felt like I could pretty quickly understand how to use Drupal and what to use it for. The combination of Drupal 5, the content construction kit, which is pretty closely analogous to the ACF ecosystem in WordPress, and the views module, which is like a query builder, and then it displays the results of the query. So you don't have to worry so much about writing SQL directly. I understood pretty quickly how to combine all of those. For whatever reason, Joomla never clicked in my brain. Like I could kind of figure out how to put web pages together, but it never clicked for me. So I never used it deeply.
I mean, similar here, although I kind of went the WordPress way. But what's interesting that, many years ago, they had almost a similar market share. And right now, WordPress has this 40%, and Joomla and Drupal have, according to WP3 Tech, around 1%-ish. And the question is, what happened?
Well,
what went wrong?
If we could spend this whole time on memory lane, because I am big on memory lane sort of stuff. So the first DrupalCon I ever attended, the first 3,000 person Drupal conference after attending some local events, was DrupalCon 2010 in San Francisco. And I remember that DrupalCon for lots of reasons. One of which was Dries Woutart, the benevolent dictator for life of Drupal. He gives a keynote presentation at every DrupalCon, similar to what the state of the word has been historically for the WordPress community. And in that presentation, 2010, he talked about Drupal hitting 1% of the web, and WordPress being something like 8% of the web in 2010. And he emphasized that he saw differences in the bets that WordPress and Drupal were making. And he was comfortable making the bet in 2010 that Drupal should be, and I may be misremembering some of the phrasing here, but basically he was comfortable with Drupal regularly reinventing itself. At that point, Drupal was on a cadence of doing significant rewrites of Drupal Core, such that to move a website from Drupal 5 to Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, so eventually Drupal 8 was released in 2015, for websites past a certain point of complexity, like if it's a professional grade website, for some definition of professional grade, then you really weren't going to use the upgrade techniques that were built into Drupal Core, which were viable for very simple websites. You were going to just build a whole new website in whatever the new version of Drupal was, and then you were going to migrate all of your content to the new website. And Dries was comfortable betting on that mode of doing things, and it made sense for a while. It's greatly slowed down the expansion of the community around that era. And I could spend 10 more minutes talking about why if you want, but I'll pause there.
Okay, so it was all connected with those breaking changes that I kind of understand that users at some point were, why waste time in a CMS that I know that in a year or two, I won't be able to do anything without it apart from maintaining and migrating to a new version.
So I think part of the reason that strategy was even viable in the first place was that was an era where the devices of the web were radically changing. So it's meaningful that I built my first Drupal sites in 2007. The iPhone was released in 2007. The iPad was released in 2010. That year I first went to DrupalCon. And in that time, it's viable to think I now need to make my website run on a device that goes from portrait to landscape, and it has a camera, and it has a touch screen. This is so different. Upgrading my site built before the iPhone or before the iPad, that's going to be so time consuming. I'll be better off just starting from scratch. And that is probably what made it viable to do a whole redesign, relaunch. Not the new stuff in Drupal 6 is so amazing, it's worth throwing your whole Drupal 5 site. Oh wait, no, it's that your Drupal 6 site or your Drupal 7 site has to squish now, and your Drupal 5 site was not built to squish.
Okay, so now let's go a bit what happened a few weeks ago. After 24 years, Drupal CMS 1.0 is released. So there are a few questions. First of all, why 1.0? And second, what is the difference between Drupal CMS and Drupal Core?
Yes, so that is the question to ask, because just hearing Drupal CMS got released in January of 2025. Didn't Drupal get released in January of 2001? So yes, the distinction is that there is a new thing called Drupal CMS, and yes, the naming is confusing, but it's more understandable when you remember that, oh yeah, there is still a thing called Drupal Core, and there is a new way of building on top of Drupal Core. Drupal, in the last few years, has added the concept of recipes. So Drupal has always had modules the same way WordPress has had plugins. And you install a module, and then you upgrade the module, and there are modules in Core, and there are modules not in Core, same way there are plugins. A very small number of plugins in WordPress Core, and then plugins that you add on to WordPress. That dynamic has always been present in Drupal. But to accelerate the maturation of Drupal, to make Drupal more approachable to particularly the marketers and content editors who have to use Drupal, it's beneficial for the Drupal community to invent this new construct that can move faster than Core, because Core is, I'll say, appropriately cautious about the way it adds and expands functionality. The Drupal community takes security and stability very, very seriously, and I see that as a net positive, but to some degree it can slow down the pace of innovation in a negative way. So by inventing a new sort of boundary, the boundary of recipes, as they're called, the Drupal community can agree to focus its energy on this new set of recipes that's being called Drupal CMS, and bring into those recipes contrib modules, as they're called. And those modules don't necessarily have to go through all of the rigor that would be necessary to bring them into Drupal Core. Like moving a module from contrib to Drupal Core is a years-long effort, and that is just not worth it in many cases. So part of the work of making Drupal CMS is the community deciding just what's the best way to do SEO functionality? What's the best way to do search functionality? Drupal's greatest strength, its greatest weakness to some degree, is its configurability. Drupal is massively configurable. You add a module and you get so many checkboxes, especially for something like search or SEO. And adding checkboxes is easy. Taking checkboxes away from anything is nearly impossible. And so with recipes, we get this convention of the community. For some definition, the community is deciding that this particular combination of modules and configuration is just the best way to do SEO in Drupal right now in January or February 2025. And that's very beneficial to teams that are building on top of Drupal Core and just don't want to have to think too deeply about SEO or search or any number of things that paying clients expect to just be there out of the box. So I was recently chatting with an agency, and they said something like, yeah, these recipes are taking what otherwise would be 4 or 10 or 50 hours of clicking, and they're compressing it into just a minute of apply a recipe. So you do get this out of the box experience with Drupal CMS. For much of Pantheon's ecosystem, which is very much in the agency world, the value will be seen more in the individual recipes that make up Drupal CMS.
Okay, so in short, the Drupal core will stay as small as possible, but focus on security, on making sure it's working constantly without any problem. And the CMS will be this opinionated set of modules and default values and configuration that will make your adventure with Drupal much simpler, especially at the beginning.
Yes.
But also when you're even an advanced person, well, as you mentioned with this agency example, a lot of hours will be saved.
Yeah, and another benefit for agencies is it expands the number of the number of people within the team who can do certain tasks. Like one of the ways we've seen the value of Pantheon as a platform that runs Drupal and WordPress sites is it expands the number of people inside an agency who can like start a new project. Because if you are doing DIY DevOps, then the number of people who can do the server level or the CI level configuration to start a new project might only be like 1 or 2 people at your company. But if there are just a few buttons inside of Pantheon that let you spin up a new site, well then practically anyone can like do the steps necessary to kick off the project. The same goes for some of this fine-grained configuration. If there's only one person in your 24-person agency who deeply understands the nuances of Search API Solr module, well then maybe that person is the only one who should be touching those. But if all of that knowledge has been consolidated into a recipe, then anyone can apply the recipe and have something functional. And if any individual client project truly needs different sets of checkboxes, well then okay, spend the time to do that. But otherwise, just take what worked either for your last project or the last 10 projects or just for the whole Drupal community and apply that.
In short, this really sounds great. I mean, those recipes are like something perfect for agencies that, let's be honest, they mostly start in the same way. Every project starts in a similar way, and repeating over and over and clicking the same things, it's just a waste of time.
Yes, and it sidesteps the downsides of inheritance. So previous attempts in the Drupal community, also going back to DrupalCon San Francisco 2010, also in that Dries keynote, he was talking up the idea of distribution, sort of products built on top of Drupal. So in that time, there was a distribution called Open Atrium. That was sort of like a Basecamp project management type of tool built entirely in Drupal. It's like, oh, you installed this thing called Open Atrium and you get a task management tool built in Drupal. Well, when Drupal people get their hands on it, they're like, okay, I'm here because this is Drupal and I love the configurability of Drupal. But the maintainers of Open Atrium are appropriately thinking, for us to maintain this, we got to lock down a lot of details. And well, then nobody's happy because the Drupal people want to take anything built in Drupal and configure anything they want. And people who are trying to maintain a product in perpetuity need to lock down some decisions. You know, in the WordPress parlance, decisions, not options. So recipes sidestep that, because rather than having a distribution that you install at the beginning of a project and then inherit updates forever, you can take an existing site and apply a recipe on top of it. Like for my own website, stevevector.com, I want a better way to do YouTube embeds. And I have known there are too many ways to do YouTube embeds in Drupal, just as there are in WordPress. And so I've just kind of put that on the back burner. But with Drupal CMS, there is now a recipe for remote videos. And I don't have to carve out many hours to do like a side-by-side comparison, or what are the pros and cons, the many different ways I could set up my data structure. Should I use a video node type? Do I use a file? What's a media entity? I haven't kept up with all of these details. And I can see, Drupal CMS has a recipe for remote videos. It's built to handle YouTube videos. How about I just apply that recipe on top of my existing site? It'll bring over the configuration. And yes, there are some modules there that like do update and inherit updates as updates come out, but much of it is applying configuration that I could have manually clicked together in who knows how many minutes or hours. Instead, I just apply the recipe, get the configuration. I'm trying it out. I like what I got. I am seeing, I should, for my purposes, add on a few more things, and maybe those get contributed back as additions to the recipe, maybe not. But it kicked me out of sort of an analysis paralysis state.
True. So tell me, what would be the most ideal Drupal CMS use case?
So the use case that is being focused on in the recent Dries notes, the keynote presentations from the founder, the situation being focused on is, let's imagine an ambitious marketer, someone whose job it is to operate the CMS. And in the specific examples and demos that Dries has done, it's someone who is working on a website that offers wine tours, like tours of vineyards. And they think, I know Drupal is powerful. I know Drupal could put together an event calendar and all this other functionality, but I, the marketer, don't have the expertise to click all of the clicks. And my IT people are stretched too thin and they don't have time to help me. What could I do? So the demos that are being done of Drupal CMS and these show someone who doesn't have pre-existing Drupal expertise, like applying recipes and often interacting with an AI agent inside of Drupal. So that's something not exactly specific to Drupal CMS, but something that could make the vision of Drupal CMS succeed or not. So if the vision is more types of people can actually do their jobs and feel empowered by Drupal, different from the status quo where only people who have been deep in the weeds and know which clicks to click are able to assemble functionality with Drupal. What if you could just type the same way you do with ChatGPT? Can you make me an events calendar? The demos work, and we see it working. I am also cognizant of the fact that like we're riding what must be a typical hype cycle. Like the demos work. It looks cool, the hype is going up, and then we'll find and in some ways this doesn't yet fulfill all the promises. But then I do expect we'll start climbing out of the trough of disillusionment, as it's called, on the hype cycle. So yeah, the ideal use case is empowering the kinds of people who haven't been able to really get their hands into Drupal. To be seen whether or not the hype will be met there well enough. For my role at Pantheon, I'm focused more on, can agencies really use these conventions that have been built up around the focusing point of Drupal CMS? Can they use those recipes and AI agents, which there's a recipe for an AI agent, which probably can then apply more recipes? Can they use those tools to do the jobs they've been doing all along faster, more effectively, and it looks like yes.
I must admit that the AI agent was something that is really great, because I also decided, Drupal 1.0 is here. What is happening? I have to check it out, right? And I wasn't using Drupal for many years, so I didn't felt that. Yeah, this is my admin panel that I totally understand. So no, I was totally the opposite of it. But the AI agent was something great because I could ask it constantly. Okay, I would like to do something. For example, I would like to create a new post type. What should I do? I didn't even ask him to do it for me because I didn't need it, because I still see myself as a developer, right? So I should be able to click things on my own. But I thought that this using of this AI agent is a really great workaround of not entirely clear UX, especially the thing that you mentioned, a lot of checkboxes, like gazillion of them. I never saw that many checkboxes, but on the other hand, I was really impressed that you can really configure like everything, whatever you can, whatever you want, you can do it. Problem is that very often you don't know where to find this option.
Right.
But you have this AI agent that will help you. So this was a very clever workaround that I think might help a lot of people who are just starting their adventure. They just installed Drupal and they're like, okay, I see checkboxes. What now?
Yeah.
And this AI agent was really a great help for me. But when I also saw the demo when this AI agent can do stuff for me, it was like, whoa, that's pretty amazing.
Yes, and
this hype train that you mentioned, it's like, wow.
And I think to fulfill the hype, we should keep many or all of the development best practices that have been maturing in the CMS community, in the PHP community, in the DevOps community for the last decade plus. Like, it is still a good idea to do code and configuration changes in different Git branches. Whether or not the configuration changes are being manually clicked by a developer or they're being auto-magically done all at once by an AI agent, I still want there to be a pull request in which a a human developer says something like, I had the user story in my sprint to build the functionality that brings in, arbitrary YouTube videos, and content editors need to be able to take YouTube URLs, put them in the user interface, hit save, ideally get the title and the description carried over from YouTube by default, and possibly edit those. Like, that user story still exists. I don't think, to my knowledge, AI has not replaced user stories or whatever you want to use to track your work yet anyway. So that user story still exists. Somebody's got to do it in a given sprint if you use sprints. And it probably still is a good idea to open a pull request that says, okay, here are the changes that bring about the YouTube embedding. And it's still probably a good idea to write automated tests if you're the type of team that likes automated tests. And if the AI agents can help you write the automated tests, all the better. So I see the value of AI right now as speeding up the amount of time in between developers saying, like, okay, I have the user story to do the YouTube stuff, and the pull request being opened saying the YouTube stuff is ready. Before, that might have taken a larger number of hours. AI agents are shrinking the number of hours. Still, human beings need to take accountability for whether or not it works. Like, if it doesn't work, your paying client will still be mad at you and maybe fire you or your agency, regardless of whether or not an AI agent was involved in clicking the clicks in the first place.
Yeah, that blaming the AI agent for your mistakes would be a poor tactic. But who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe it will work.
Yeah, to me, it's not that different from, like, if I had that user story today without AI, like, I'd be Googling. I'd be either copying and pasting something from Stack Overflow. I'd be watching a tutorial and simulating the clicks. And then I still have to take responsibility for evaluating, did I do a good job, regardless of, did I get guidance from what I read on Google, from documentation, from an AI agent? I, as a human being, still need to take responsibility for the pull request that I'm opening.
Yeah, true. But still, I must admit, really, that putting those agents inside of Drupal was a great idea. Because, I started with a classical approach. If I didn't knew how to find something, I Googled. But then sometimes I got a link to an older version of Drupal, or there wasn't a documentation for something. And this, at some point, this was the moment. Okay, let me try this AI agent, because that was the last thing I was thinking about when I installed Drupal CMS, and I was, like I said, I was amazed, because it was like my personal guide, and this was something that, like we already mentioned, will make the adoption much easier, faster, and we can ask AI every stupid question that we have, right? We can.
And one of my colleagues, Chris Reynolds, who has got a long history in WordPress, and even though he's been working at Pantheon for a few years, and we do both Drupal and WordPress, he still has a lot to learn about the ins and outs of Drupal. And being able to just talk to an AI agent inside of a Drupal installation has been immensely helpful for him at that.
So I think that, because right now we were talking just about Drupal, so maybe let's try to compare WordPress and Drupal. When would you say that someone should give Drupal a try over WordPress, where Drupal like really shines and it's, let's use this word, is better?
Sure. So I'll just say that I'll describe the thing that brought me into Drupal in the first place, because I think this dynamic still holds. So I jumped from WordPress to Drupal around 2007, when I went from working on a blog for a theater company. And I should immediately say, like, yes, WordPress can do more than blogs, but in 2006, I had made a blog for a theater company, and then they wanted me to replace the entirety of their older hand-coded HTML main website with something else, and it needed to be able to track and display information like every theatrical production they've ever done, the dates of every single upcoming performance, ideally the names of all of the actors, and ideally which roles each actor played in any given performance. And wouldn't it be nice as well if you could click on the actor's name and then see every performance they've ever been in. So building up a complex data model like that is just more normalized in the Drupal world. And similar things are possible with the ACF suite and other tools inside of WordPress, but they're more normalized in Drupal. They've been in Drupal Core since Drupal 7, which came out in 2011. So if I were working on that sort of site where I need to model a lot of content types and fields in the Drupal language, I would gravitate towards Drupal because the modules are there. I don't need to pay for the pro version. And then views module is a big one that doesn't have a clear WordPress equivalent. So in addition to being able to build out all of this complex data structure inside of Drupal, views module then gives you the power to build complex queries around those data structures and display the results.
Okay, and now another question, but a bit similar. And which cases you can imagine where persons should really go with WordPress and never, but ever try to use Drupal because it won't just work?
So one case study I found persuasive at WordCamp US this last year was the case study from Vox Media, which had famously built their own CMS, Chorus, and they decided in the last few years to stop building and maintaining their own CMS, and they chose WordPress and WordPress in a headless fashion. And they chose it for any number of reasons. I recommend going back and watching that whole conference presentation, but they picked it in part because of its ubiquity. Like, Fox is a huge publishing organization with multiple different brands. There's Fox.com, there's The Verge. And for them, the ability to onboard new employees and say, like, WordPress, right? And practically anyone in the publishing world will be able to say, like, yeah, we know WordPress. And okay, here's your WordPress interface. We're publishing multiple news stories a day. Here you go. That use case still makes a lot of sense.
True. Yeah, this is something that I also know, that the fact that WordPress is so familiar, it changes a lot, because here we are looking at those CMSs from a bit different perspective, because we are looking at them as those technical things that we build, that we maintain, that we try to grow, while most of people are just using them. So they kind of don't care about a lot of things that we care about. For example, recipes, amazing thing. But for a person who just writes those news, they don't care.
They don't care. They say, my my news article needs to be able to display multiple authors in a better way. Just do that thing. And if that thing is done by a recipe or through manual clicking, that person requesting it doesn't really care.
Honestly, you kind of surprised me, because you went with the example of a huge corporation, right? Because Fox is huge. Because I thought that you will go more with an example of those beginners who prefer those.
Oh, absolutely not.
No code.
The 40% of the web that uses WordPress has a very diverse set. It covers practically all of the types of websites on the internet. And yes, there are people who don't particularly care about websites at all, who just need to do a thing, and they're pursuing whatever seems like the lowest friction way to do it. And for some of them, like, click, end up on WordPress.com or Bluehost, like, that's fine. I mean, that's how I started using WordPress. I overheard that artistic director of the theater company say, like, we need a blog, and I just followed the path of least friction, and that led me to WordPress. So that still exists. But there are people doing incredibly complex things in WordPress, and especially talking with security-minded people, I still hold hope for the composerification of WordPress. Partly because Composer makes it easier to manage patches. I applied a patch to a website recently just by declaring that patch at the root of my Composer JSON file, and that's it. I felt like I need to say more. No, I added that little bit of JSON to the root of my project, the Composer JSON file. Like, I need this patch. It hasn't been merged into Core yet. And then, I don't know, I guess I ran Composer update or Composer install, and the patch was applied, and great. Without something like Composer as a community, as a PHP-wide way to manage code, teams end up reinventing the wheel. I'm like, how do we track the patches that we've applied that are either functionality fixes or maybe security fixes, but like, how do you track those? And people end up reinventing all sorts of wheels, and just put your patches at the root of your Composer file or at the root of your project in your Composer JSON is the cleanest answer I've ever seen. And it works pretty well.
Yeah, and this is kind of my next question, security.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know that when we talk about WordPress and security, that's a difficult topic, right? And let's end with this. Let's end with this part. But how does Drupal handle security? And
so
maybe not only Drupal, the whole ecosystem, because it's kind of the same thing like with WordPress. WordPress has a really strong core, but the ecosystem is the weak link. And how does it look in Drupal?
At Pantheon, we need to speak to that all the time, because there is a community reputational issue with WordPress, especially enterprises that have IT pros who are concerned about security. They may hear from one corner of the company, oh yeah, we're building that new site and we're building it on WordPress. And that might send those IT folks into a panic, because they hear WordPress and there's a good chance they have associations from past work experience of WordPress sites getting hacked and all sorts of things. And in many cases, it's not WordPress fault per se. Like, so many of the WordPress vulnerabilities depend on a writable file system. And the WordPress community does cultivate that expectation that the whole file system should be writable, and to some degree there are security benefits from a live website being able to apply updates immediately in an auto updates kind of fashion. But like at Pantheon, we take the perspective of like letting a PHP application rewrite itself in prod. That is an unacceptable security risk. So we just don't allow that. Like on Pantheon, the live environment, the test environment, any files under version control in Git can't be changed by anything but Git. Like, commit your WordPress code to Git, push it up, dev test live, and there you go. So probably the plurality of security vulnerabilities depend on file system exploitation. A lot of them run through MySQL injection, and Pantheon can do things at the edge layer to minimize that threat. Like, security is not a totally black and white issue. It's about adding layers of security, closing off attack vectors as much as possible. And part of the reason why WordPress has a bad reputation for security is it's run everywhere. It's 40% of the web. So definitionally, it is run in places that don't bring that defense in depth mindset.
Yeah, and this is something that you just mentioned about Pantheon. Because when we look at WordPress security, we see that it's not quite handled in a centralized way if we look at the whole picture. Because, of course, the core takes care of the core, and they're doing a really good job, because WordPress core is, let's be honest, it's secure. Most of the problems comes from plugins and from the fact of this very low entry level of, so it's very easy to start using WordPress. So people without any technical knowledge can start self-hosting a CMS without knowing about a lot of consequences. On the other hand, we have those third-party companies that try to help, for example, like PatchSec, and also, the hosting companies, because they are also doing a lot of great job making sure that nothing bad happens with it. So we can see that the whole ecosystem is trying to make WordPress more secure, because still there is still a lot of problems. And how does it look in Drupal? Is it also kind of divided by this, or is it more centralized?
Somewhat. So there's a Drupal security team that oversees core and contrib, as it's called. And so that security team You can contact that security team if you discover a vulnerability. There's a process for discreetly disclosing security vulnerabilities. I'll say and then that team is responsible for overseeing on Wednesdays. It's always on Wednesdays that security fixes are published. So most Wednesdays I get a series of emails, usually early afternoon, saying like sometimes core, but it's usually contrib modules. I'll just get one email per module saying like, this module has a security release, and there are links to the information, credits to the people who discovered the issue. I'll say the first time I interacted with that team was when I found a small vulnerability of sorts in code that had been published by the White House, that had been just published by the United States government. It was the theme of whitehouse.gov at the time. And I saw that, I heard, oh yeah, the White House is publishing a Drupal theme. I thought, amazing, the White House is publishing a Drupal theme? What are we going to do? It's on Drupal.org. Are people going to be able to like use the same theme as the White House? And I quickly realized like, no, like you can in WordPress, you can in Drupal as well, hard code into your theme. Like you can hard code your footer into the theme. And some people might say like, no, there are ways to build out your footer and the UI don't hard code the footer, but like the White House hard coded their footer. So anyway, I discovered in one of the template files an XSS vulnerability, a cross-site scripting vulnerability, just meaning I saw in a template file like, oh, here's a field that is printing its actual value. This printing is not using the escaping techniques that are normalized in Drupal. And so I contacted the security team, even though this theme was published as a beta, meaning the security team didn't officially have dominion over it. The security team has policies as to which modules and themes they pay attention to and which they don't. But I was like, they might want to know about this one. And so it pretty quickly got fixed. But I thought that was illustrative of a few things. One, like security is hard. And that particular vulnerability was representative of why the Drupal community switched to Twig, because it was just too darn easy and common to, without realizing it, print the raw, unescaped value from a field. And while in security discourse, we often imagine like the worst possible case scenario or the most complex way in which a site might get attacked. But then, okay, the vast majority of Drupal sites that have custom themes have this problem where at least in one template, at least one field is being printed with its unescaped value. Like before Twig came in Drupal 8, which to some degree closed that problem, mostly closed that problem, it was, I think if you had looked at the vast majority of Drupal 5, 6, or 7 sites with a careful eye, you would have found that problem. And so many of the security risks that are out there in reality are like, the security risk isn't coming from an outside hacker. It's being put in by the team that just isn't thinking about that issue. But at the same time, you have to think like, okay, what would be necessary for that vulnerability to actually be exploited on this? There's only one website in the world that runs the theme for White House. How would that actually get exploited? Someone who has capacity to add content to whitehouse.gov would either need to maliciously or be tricked into adding like a JavaScript file into, or a call to a JavaScript file. And like, that's probably not going to happen. The background checks necessary for some, probably. But anyway, all that to say, the Drupal security team was on top of that one pretty quickly.
So if I understand correctly, the Drupal security team kind of not only takes care of the core, but also everything that's in the repository, right?
Yeah.
The whole.
So contrib modules that opt in to it. So I don't know all the rules off the top of my head, but I think they only cover releases that are not labeled as alpha or beta, and then I think individual contributors can opt in or opt out of participation with the security team. And I should say, I have been on the other side of it as well. I have been a maintainer of a module and gotten reports from someone who discovered a vulnerability in a module where I was one of the half dozen or so maintainers, and I was very impressed at how well the the security team identifies the issue, helps identify what would be necessary to remediate the issue, and then get the fix out the door.
I mean, that's their job. That's their job.
Well, in many cases, it is a volunteer job.
Open source.
In many cases, it's open source. In some cases, it's people who work for companies like Pantheon, and to some degree, it's their job to spend time on such things. I'm not on the team myself, but our co-founder, one of our co-founders, David Strauss, has been deep in the security world for a long time. We also contribute to a program called Drupal Stewards, where we, by contributing financially to this program, we get advance notice when there is a significant, for some definition of significant, that's getting resolved. A year or two ago, I was on the Pantheon side involved because we were notified through the Stewards program that a core fix was coming, and we saw potential to make tweaks at our edge layer so that, we of course encourage our customers to apply security fixes to their Drupal sites as soon as they're available, but we don't make them. And we saw years ago there was a security incident that colloquially has been referred to as Drupal-geddon, meaning Drupal scores security issues on a 25-point scale, and I think this was maybe the only 25 out of 20. And I was not working at Pantheon at the time, but what I heard was that from our logs, we could see, oh yes, within a few hours of this core issue coming out, somebody in the world is working down an alphabetical list of Drupal sites and attempting to exploit it within a few hours. So while Pantheon encouraged customers to apply that change ASAP, for that one as well, I think we made changes at the time. Our varnish layer, we now run varnish inside the global CDN. So when we hear about these kinds of issues, we can put in mitigations for everybody, because often these kinds of run through very complex URLs that are suspicious, where a pattern can be mitigated.
Okay, so I think that we can very slowly start to wrap up. So imagine there is a developer in front of you who is a bit tired of the current situation in WordPress, and he's looking for a new CMS. And he heard some great things about Drupal. And he isn't entirely sure if he or she should give it a try. How would you try to sell Drupal to such a developer? Why he or she should try?
Fine. You can see in my background, I like Legos. And one of the things that has drawn me to Drupal is the way I feel that it fulfills the Lego mindset that people all over the tech community compare our tech work to building with Legos. I find that Drupal fulfills that feeling in a way that I don't get with other systems. The way the modules click together, the way the fields click together, I find it viscerally enjoyable. And if someone is approaching this question on a personal level, it's the feelings that will move a person or not. Like, I can describe the ways in which I find Drupal can be made more performant more easily. That is nice. The way Drupal does caching, fine-grained caching, bubbling up cache contexts is incredibly impressive. It's been an amazing feature since Drupal 8. It enables all sorts of performance optimizations. I find that fun as well, and it makes for a good end result. But I think what has the potential to move any single person from one system to another is, are you going to get enjoyment from it? And I enjoy building with Composer. Drupal for years, even before Composer, had the concept of dependencies. And while in my time at Pantheon, I've mostly been seeing Drupal and WordPress are not nearly as different as they've been made out to be. Like, that each community thinks the other one is way different than it. Like, they are closely related siblings. I wouldn't even say cousins. Like, they're siblings that somehow got separated. So one of the stark differences, though, is that with Drupal, you get the expectation that you install a module like Search API, and then that gets extended by Search API Solar, and then that gets extended by Search API Pantheon. And these things build on one another in a way that I find just satisfying and exciting. The feeling of I don't want to write any more code than I absolutely have to. I find it satisfying that Pantheon's Solar Search module is relatively small, that our caching module is tiny because it's leveraging the functionality that is already there in Drupal Core, and all Pantheon needs to do to make it significantly more valuable is pass along the caching metadata that is coming out of Drupal Core already. We give that to our CDN, and then similar to recipes, then you don't have to do a lot of complex clicking that would otherwise be necessary to get the CMS and the CDN talking with one another as well. We do that for you in a shockingly small amount of code.
I must admit that if someone would say, yeah, go with Drupal because it's like Legos, you bought me. I mean,
great.
In my case,
and I didn't
you probably don't see it, but I also have a lot of Legos in the background. So yeah, So yeah.
And I didn't even mention single directory components. Over the years, where I felt the Lego metaphor breaks down is in theming, where it's not so much Legos, like the way we've written CSS is more like we're melting our Legos. We're drawing with permanent marker on top of the Legos to make it look the way it's supposed to. And with the single directory component concept that has risen up in Drupal in the last few years, and it's like, it is not a Drupal CMS specific feature, but it's one of the ideas that is flowing along with Drupal CMS. Like we're fulfilling the Lego feeling much better with single directory components, as they're called.
Okay, so I'm sure that probably the title of this talk will end up with Drupal is like Lego. Probably something like this.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good. And what would be the best way to start your adventure with Drupal, like right now in 2025? You just heard about Drupal. You want to give it a try. What to do?
I'd say install Drupal CMS on Pantheon, because then you don't have to worry about the map details that I had to worry about when I got started in 2007. Like if you enjoy local development tools, DDev is a great Docker-based option for running things locally. If that's your thing, you can install Drupal Core or Drupal CMS pretty easily with DDev. But if you just want to click, Pantheon has a way to spin up a fresh instance of Drupal CMS in a few clicks.
Okay, so I think we know enough, at least enough to get started with Drupal.
All right.
So, like I said, this analogy to Legos really worked for me. So definitely I will have to give it another try. So,
all right, I'm happy to hear it.
Thank you very much for explaining a lot about Drupal's history, about how it compares with WordPress, about how security in Drupal works, because that's a very important aspect for many of us. Yeah, I hope that everyone will at least give Drupal CMS a try. Because, like I mentioned at the beginning, Drupal doesn't get enough attention that it should, because it's a really good CMS. So with this, I want to say, Steve, thanks once again for sharing all your knowledge, and see you everyone. Bye.